I'm Ramin. I've worked on 24/7 systems since about 1996. Been a mix of everything from small startups to ISPs to web apps, video streaming, and things with billions of pages. And I really only kind of say it to show that I've actually broken all of that at some point. Pretty much caused an outage everywhere. Sometimes they're very small. And sometimes, they end up on CNN. That's a little bit freaky when that sort of stuff happens. There's always a lot of conspiracy theories about how things broke. And the reality is we screwed up most of the time. So, fun stuff. And really in that case, it was the, hey, our positive test worked, our negative test we forgot to run. It turns out most of production was the negative test. And there you go. So, and I changed the name of this to part 1 out of part 3 because I was going to do before outages and after outages and during outages, but really we just have time for before the outages. And I wanted to start off on a good note that, I'm fallible and often overbearing, so I found this cool poem, which really talks about kind of talking down to people and thinking just because you know a couple of things, you might know the secret to everything. That is not true. Your system is your system, and the way you run it needs to be a decision you make. Please don't go back to work tomorrow and go, this guy stood on a stage and told me things. I will certainly tell you things, but whether they're valid or not is a good question. All right. So what do you call it? This talk is preparing for the outages you're going to cause because you're going to cause outages. It's pretty much impossible to have an outage-free career. I'd say absolutely impossible. Things like chaos theory, second law of thermodynamics will tell you you just can't win. The other thing is there's 2 names on here at the bottom, Sidney Dekker and Eric Holnagel. They pretty much wrote the book literally on safety, human factors in safety, and resilience engineering. If you want to know more about this, these are definite people. I would go read their books. Sidney Dekker is a little bit more easy to kind of wrap your head around. Eric tends to be a little bit more academic, I think is a good way to put it. Sidney Dekker wrote the Just Culture and Drift into Failure. Both of those are fairly easy read. You can kind of read of a chapter at a time and get quite a bit out of them. The second thing I want to do was pull in yet another book. This one is Thinking in Systems by Donella Meadows. I see some people, so well done. This really changed the way I think about systems engineering. And what I really liked about what she said was you can't tell the system what to do. You can really only enhance the flows that kind of get you to the goal you want. And I thought this was a good way because I can't go into work tomorrow and announce we will have no outages. It just doesn't work. So you've got to build systems that and flows that help you get to reasonable outcomes. And in this case, we can't stop them, but we can perhaps starve them of resources. And I think that's the way to think about it. Okay, boundary conditions, because I don't think certain outages are interesting. If you do a release and cause an outage, that's interesting. If you didn't update your SSL cert and cause an outage, that's not interesting. So one of these is the outage of inaction, and that's forgetting to do your maintenance or not making reasonable plans. Your outages of action, I think, are where we've got, that's our interesting thing. And we can think about that in a way that lets us move forward. The other thing is when you break something through action, you pretty much know what caused it. You're I did a thing, I changed those 2 lines, my site broke, I bet I know where the problem is. When you have these outages of inaction, you're we didn't do something for 6 months and now the site broke. I don't even know where to start. I mean, it could be anything. And really at that point, all you can do is go, all right, call the person who's been here the longest with the most context, and hopefully they know what that thing is. And that's a terrible thing to do in this economy. We're going to hire super duper 20-year engineer. They know stuff, hopefully the random stuff we need to hopefully fix this problem today. And that's why really we want systems that you're having a conversation with. You're doing a lot of releases and you're breaking that system down into better components, better separation, nice interfaces, things where you don't need somebody with a crap ton of context to come in and go, it was that thing. That's really as cool as it is sometimes to be a person who's I know what that is. It's not the way your team wants to run a system. So the other thing is, it really depends on where in the stack you are. Um, like the further down the stack you are, the larger your outage is going to be. Being a terrible network engineer in the 90s, that's honestly why I don't do it anymore. Also, the tools were terrible. But I do work in infrastructure, and when I screw up, I can break entire sites for like a good 2 hours. And if you're on the front end, you can certainly break the site, but you're a lot easier to recover from. If you break DNS, you might break all the Hadoop and all the CDN and all the sites. It's a lot of fun. So it is something to be aware of. Like depending on where the stack is, you may operate differently. You may assess risk differently, and that's okay. Just be aware of like what your actual blast radius is. Right. Actually, I'm going to make this smaller. I can read it. All right. What do you call it? So the best way to get good at releases and not have big outages in your releases is to do releases. What do you call it? You want to be a little bit smart at it. So in high school, I was a terrible gymnast because I thought like for certain strength moves, the more you did them, eventually they would just work because you'd get it right. The reality is somebody needed to lift weights for 6 months, and then you could certainly do a lot of these strength moves. But like nobody really explained this to 14-year-old me, and I was kind of an idiot. So releases are like that too. If you can do releases, if you do them over and over again, you get better, but you actually need some coaching. You need to sit down and go, where are our weaknesses? And really going through that cycle, kind of the virtuous cycle of releasing, deciding what didn't work, what did work, is how you get good at it. The other thing is I like releases. I like releasing every day. Probably the best I ever did, I did 30 releases to production a day for like a month. I was trying to move to a new system, and that was just the way forward. I see companies talk about managing risk, but really a lot of times that's code for avoiding risk, or as I like to call it, stockpiling risk to a later when somebody needs to like actually go get something done. Things like blocking releases, Friday moratoriums, artificial gates on releases. I think all of these are terrible ideas. Depending on your team knows how to release software or like how to gate that. I see people try and start committees for releases when there are problems, and it's cool. Like, all right, I'm going to proxy all our outgoing traffic through CGNAT. What does that mean, front-end developer and or back-end developer or DBA or anybody who's not a network engineer? And like all of a sudden, you're trying to get sign-off by teams with no expertise, and I don't think there's any value in that. However, there is value in trusting the teams. So even if sometimes the committees are okay if they're just like, do you have a plan? Is it written down? Is it automated? If I click this button, does it go? If I click this button, does it reverse? Like that kind of stuff's good. But generally, like I don't believe this work should be done is not, I think, something useful. All right, the other thing is releases exercise your mental model. Like you're going to do a release, you've probably got a hypothesis on something that'll make the system better. You release that into production, either it makes the system better or it does not, or it does nothing. But you're kind of having this conversation with your mental model of, I thought this, I wrote this, I released it, this happened. And the more releases you do, the higher resolution. Like I kind of view it as sonar of like, okay, I'm sending out lots of pings, I have a good idea of how the system is. People talk about haunted parts of the system where like nobody's released in years. And like, oh, don't touch that, and nobody knows how it works anymore. Versus like things where like in your main path, you're like constantly hitting on that. You're like, everybody knows how that thing works. We released that 50 times this week. And the other thing is like, if like your releases, because you're doing so many, they tend to get smaller and high resolution, have smaller pixels. And this is just a better analogy than I had totally planned. So run with it. And that kind of brings us to small batch sizes. Small batch sizes are really the secret weapon. If you're trying to do big, large releases, there's honestly no way to be agile that way. Like you've got a ton of stuff, it goes, people sort of understand it. If I have to review your 1,000-line change, I'm gonna go, are you gonna sit there while it goes? Great, fine. I mean, like I'll read it, but it's like, can I actually get through that in less than 3 days and get my own work done? Probably not. If you have a 50-line change, I'm like, problem. That's awesome, cool. Like fix these, you're good to go. And that's really, it's just less human resources the smaller your changes are, and it's easier to reason about, it's easier to test. Like, easier run through your CI/CD pipeline. Small changes tend to be easy to reverse, like, though, like you can't always go back. You can only fall forward to a new state, depending on what you're doing. But at least, like, you've broken the problem down into something reasonably sized. All right. The other thing is engineering is not just for features, they're for actually getting your release out the door, which is a feature. I've seen lots of teams go, we don't have time to fix this. Can our SRE or somebody come in, figure out how our software works, figure out how it interacts with the system, and then fix all that? And the answer is really, as an SRE, I will product manage that. I will tell you where your problems are, and I will put tickets in your sprint, and I will come back next week and go, where are these? And if they aren't there, then like I will go talk to your product manager and go, cool, what features are you dropping? Because your feature of releasing your software safely is missing. And I'm not gonna get involved with your software if you're not invested in it. And I've seen teams do really well here, like an 8-person team, like you're on call for a week, you do release-related work, you do cleanup, and it actually, like, and over time, you fix a lot of the problems, and you're like, okay, now I can, like, maybe I'll schedule half my week in, like, feature tickets. But, like, sometimes you have a bad week, and you're like, oh, new system is causing us problems. You've already got this space in your sprint to take on problems like this. So we've kind of got the do a bunch of releases, do small releases, spend time making our releases good. You need to tell the org why you're going to do a bunch of releases, particularly if your org is not moving at this. Like if you're a high volume, small change team, other teams that release once a week are going to go, what the hell are you doing? Like I've literally had this conversation where they're like, why did you do 200 releases this week? And you're like, well, that's how we work. Works pretty well. And they're like, well, we don't know why you're doing this. So like, why would anybody do this? And you're like, well, I fix a line and I push that out, and I fix another line and I push that out. And they're like, but what are you doing? So it's actually really important to like think about it, press releases of like, this is our roadmap, these are why we're doing things. Like I certainly wouldn't get down to like, I'm fixing regex matching and rsyslog today, blah, like nobody cares. But you're like, hey, I'm making sure the Splunk or whatever works on all our machines, and this is like a whole blah, blah, blah number of tickets, that'll be done this month. People are like, oh yeah, you're making things better. It kind of gives you this cover, particularly in an org where you might be a fast moving team and other teams are not. What do you call it? Also, like, when you go into a postmortem, people are like, oh yeah, that thing was important, let's go through the postmortem. Like, people get weird when they don't think your work is important. The postmortem tends to go poorly in my experience, and I don't like it, I don't think that's healthy for the org, but it can happen. All right, the other thing is, let's see, okay, so we press release, we're gonna look for failure before we release. This is pretty much like the actual conversation I'd start with my team on like, I'm getting a code review or we're just kind of reviewing a ticket of my current goal is thing, because that tells them where you're going, like I wanna get to here. And sometimes that's the wrong thing, you're like, okay, you shouldn't be going there, you should be going here. So you're already looking for correction on direction. Then you're saying my change to get here is this. And now they can go like, cool, I understand your goal, your change will or won't work. Like you're kind of bringing them along with your thinking of like goal, how I'm gonna get there. Then you move on to here's where I think my problems are going to be. So this is the work I've done to make sure there are no problems. And then you've kind of brought them along in your thinking. Because like if you just throw work over the fence, even to somebody on your team that has a lot of context, they're not always gonna get it with you. The other thing is like, what am I missing? You're inviting like, hey, I've thought about failure. I'm pretty sure there's some failure in here. What is it? You're not going, my thing is perfect, just say yes. And like, if you don't ask for this in kind of a way that goes, no, really, I want you to think with me, it really brings your team along with you. And last thing is, do we have signal? And honestly, I've worked on teams where you've like released something to Canary and people are like, well, we're gonna wait 3 days. I'm like, cool. How do we know it worked after 3 days? How do we know it didn't work? And they're like, well, nobody will complain. And I'm like, maybe something a little bit more positive, like I wanna point to a thing. Literally, there are times, particularly in infrastructure, where you don't have good insight all the way out to your edges. Like this may be the only thing you can do. I don't recommend it, but having both positive and negative signals, however you need to get there, and if that's, hey, we're going to go to a representative number of machines and like check them by hand, it's a thing you can do. It's not a fun thing, but it's certainly, we are going to get signal because we don't know how to get it any other way. All the observability stuff, people have given tons of talks here. Go get as much observability check. Have like, okay, we'll see this, we won't see this graph will get better, this graph will get worse. Whatever it takes to get there, like, have signal. So in summary, there's like 6 things there: small releases, lots of releases, signal. It just takes time to build these processes and kind of build these trust between teams that you have a process. And it takes time to treat your software as releasable. Like I've seen teams that they had like this organic Byzantine config file, and it made their automation incredibly complex. It rarely worked, and they owned that code. You're like, well, maybe we should just change that to something we can automate. And they just kind of like, well, we can't do that. You're like, well, you own the code, change it to something that's releasable. And it, like, sometimes that's upstream and it's really hard, but like, open those tickets with upstream. I've seen teams like Redis like go fix their config.dir, and like they got it out in like 2 weeks after like complaining to the guy for 6 months, like, just make config.dirs. But like, these things can happen if you push for them. You really have to engineer for them. And teamwork, that's the biggest thing for me. Is I was a small team of 1 to 2 people for years and years. Like an 8-person team is excellent, because there's always somebody who's slightly more of an expert in you in different spots, and they will see the things you didn't. So yeah, go forth, do that work, and hopefully you'll break the outages you will have very small blast radiuses, and you'll have your least worst outage. So that's pretty much it.